In the spring of 1897, an auditor's hand stopped at page 347 of the Providence Street Orphanage ledger, the final bound accounting of children received, placed, or deceased. 5 years had passed since the institution's closure. The ink was uniform, the columns balanced, every child accounted for through December 31st, 1891. Then, blank. 365 days simply absent from the record. No torn pages, no water damage, just silence bound in leather, as if 1892 had been carefully excised from institutional memory. But that part never aligned. Because the city burial registry listed 4 Providence Street children interred in the spring of 1892, their names, their ages, the orphanage cited as residents of record. Yet the ledger insisted the building had been empty for months before those deaths occurred. One document claimed they existed. Another claimed they could not have. The absence spoke louder than what remained. Before we step deeper into what the institution tried to seal, pause at this threshold. Some records surface only when examined in stillness. Their contradictions visible only when no one is rushing toward conclusion. What follows is reconstructed entirely from municipal archives, burial records, newspaper fragments, and the physical evidence still embedded in the building's foundation. Comment what you're doing as you watch this. The people who produced these records were living ordinary lives while extraordinary things were happening, and tracing your own moment alongside theirs adds perspective. The Providence Street Orphanage stood at the northern edge of industrial Hartford, Connecticut, a 3-story granite structure commissioned in 1867 to house the children of mill workers, immigrants, and families broken by the economic collapse following the war. By 1891, it sheltered 47 children between ages 4 and 16. The Board of Overseers met quarterly. Donations were modest but sufficient. Inspection reports noted adequate heating, ventilation within acceptable standards for the period, and a matron described as stern but fair. Then the record stops breathing. The building was sold in June 1893. The children dispersed to neighboring institutions, St. Agnes Home, the county poorhouse, private placements. The board dissolved. The final report, dated March 15, 1893, mentioned administrative closure following decreased capacity. It did not mention why capacity had decreased. It did not mention what had occurred during the missing year. It mentioned nothing at all about the spring of 1892, when 4 children were buried with the orphanage listed as their final address, despite the ledger's insistence that no children were present to die. Yet one detail remained unaccounted for. The burial registry held what the ledger would not. 4 entries. April through June of 1892. Each recorded with institutional precision: name, age, cause of death, location of interment. The city clerk's handwriting unchanged across all 4, steady, practiced, indifferent to what the words meant. Mary Kathleen Doherty, age 9. Thomas Edwin Carr, age 7. Eliza Jane Holbrook, age 11. Samuel Orrin Bennett, age 6. Cause of death: pneumonia, typhoid, scarlet fever, undetermined respiratory failure. Location of residence: Providence Street Orphanage, Hartford. The contradictions multiplied when cross-referenced against the orphanage's own admission records from 1889 through 1891. 3 of the 4 names appeared in earlier ledgers: children received, documented, their intake properly recorded with guardian signatures or court orders. Mary Doherty arrived in October 1889 after her mother's death in a tenement fire. Thomas Carr was surrendered by his father, a mill worker, in February 1890. Eliza Holbrook came through a police matron's custody in August 1890, found sleeping in a factory loading dock. But Samuel Bennett's name appeared nowhere in the surviving intake records. No entry, no guardian signature, no court order. He existed only in death, a child the orphanage never officially received, but somehow buried under its authority. The city required institutional documentation before a child could be interred with orphanage designation. The clerk would have needed proof of residency. Yet the proof was missing, and the burial proceeded regardless. The attending physician for all 4 deaths was listed as Dr. Horace Lindley, age 63, a general practitioner whose office stood 2 blocks from the orphanage. His name appeared in earlier inspection reports as the institution's contracted medical examiner. Competent, unremarkable, paid quarterly for routine examinations and treatment of minor ailments. 4 children dead in 3 months. 4 death certificates signed by the same physician. 4 causes of death that, while common in 1892, showed no patterns suggesting outbreak or epidemic. Pneumonia in April, typhoid in late April, scarlet fever in May, respiratory failure in June. Different illnesses, different timelines, yet all emerging from an institution the ledger claimed had already emptied. The city health department filed no epidemic report for Hartford in 1892, no quarantine orders, no public health notices regarding Providence Street or the surrounding wards. Whatever killed those 4 children did not spread beyond the orphanage walls or was never identified as spreading. The burial plots were located in Cedar Hill Cemetery, Section G, Row 14, a municipal section reserved for paupers, indigents, and unclaimed dead. Small stones, minimal inscription. The kind of graves cities purchased in bulk. 3 of the 4 stones were still legible in 1934 when a WPA surveyor documented the section. The 4th, Samuel Bennett's, had already sunk below grade, its marker either removed or dissolved by weather. But the cemetery's own records noted something the burial registry did not. The cemetery sexton's ledger recorded not just burials but payments. Standard procedure in 1892 required institutions to pay burial fees in advance. $3.50 per plot, $2 for the stone, $1.50 for the gravedigger's labor. Total cost per child, $7. The orphanage operated on a quarterly budget approved by the board. Burial expenses would have appeared in the financial summary, deducted from operational funds, noted in the year-end accounting. But the 1892 financial records were missing. Not destroyed, not lost to fire or flood, simply never filed with the city clerk's office as required by municipal charter. The 1891 records existed, complete, properly notarized, signed by the board chairman and the orphanage treasurer. The 1893 closure documents existed, sparse but present. The 12 months between them, absent. The cemetery sexton recorded payment for all 4 burials as received in full, June 18, 1892. $28 total. Paid in cash. No receipt issued to Providence Street Orphanage. No institutional signature. The payment was made, the children buried, and the transaction closed without the customary documentation linking the institution to the expense. Someone paid for those graves. Someone ensured those 4 children were interred with minimal record. Someone signed Dr. Lindley's death certificates without the institutional authority that should have required board approval. The sexton's ledger listed the payer only as PSO account, Providence Street Orphanage account. But the orphanage treasurer, a man named Thomas Whitmore, had resigned his position in February 1892. The resignation letter, discovered in a separate file decades later, gave no reason. It simply stated, "Effective immediately, I relinquish all financial authority and responsibility concerning Providence Street Orphanage. I will provide no further accounting." He was 41 years old. He had served as treasurer for 6 years. He had no history of financial misconduct. He resigned in February and 4 children were buried under the orphanage's name between April and June, with no treasurer to authorize the expense. The next documented treasurer was appointed in April 1893, 1 year after the burials, 3 months before the building was sold. That man, Albert Crane, filed no financial report for 1892. When asked by the city clerk's office to produce the missing accounting, he responded in writing, "No records were transferred to me upon appointment. I assume authority only from the date of my commission." The money existed, the graves were paid for, but the institution claimed no knowledge of the transaction. The Board of Overseers met 4 times per year, March, June, September, December. Meeting minutes were filed with the city as required by law. The minutes from March 1892 discussed routine matters, roof repairs, a coal delivery contract, the hiring of a new laundress. The minutes from June 1892 were never filed. The minutes from September 1892 were never filed. The minutes from December 1892 were never filed. 3 consecutive quarterly meetings, either never held or held and deliberately unrecorded. The orphanage charter required a quorum of 5 board members to conduct official business. The 1891 roster listed 7 members, 3 clergymen, 2 businessmen, a physician, and a lawyer. By March 1893, when the closure was finalized, only 2 remained on record. The others had resigned, moved, or simply stopped attending without formal notice. The institution dismantled itself quietly, leaving no testimony, no explanation, no accounting for the year it chose to erase. Yet the children's names remained, carved in deteriorating stone, in a cemetery section reserved for those the city buried when no one else would. The orphanage matron during the missing year was a woman named Agnes Talbot. She was 56 years old in 1892. Widowed, no children of her own. She had served as matron since 1885, 7 years of documented competence. Inspection reports described her as efficient, strict, maintaining adequate order among the children. No complaints filed against her, no disciplinary actions. She managed the daily operations, meals, laundry, bedtime, the small rituals that structured institutional life. Her employment ended in July 1892. The termination record was discovered in a municipal storage facility in 1961, misfiled under T instead of P for Providence Street. A single type page, unsigned, undated except for the handwritten notation, July 1892, in the margin. It stated, Mrs. Agnes Talbot relieved of duties, no replacement appointed. No severance pay documented, no forwarding address, no reason given. She vanished from Hartford City Directory after 1892. Her name did not appear in the 1893 census, nor in any subsequent directory for Connecticut, Massachusetts, or Rhode Island. She did not remarry, no marriage license on record. She did not die in Hartford, no death certificate filed locally. She simply ceased to exist in the documentary record, as if the same hand that erased the ledger had also erased her. But one piece of her presence remained. In 1936, a demolition crew preparing to raise the Providence Street building discovered a small metal box wedged behind a loose brick in the basement. The box contained personal effects, a tarnished locket, 3 buttons, a tin of sewing needles, and a folded piece of paper. The paper was a page torn from a personal diary, not the institutional log, but a private record. The entry was dated March 14, 1892. The handwriting matched signatures on earlier orphanage documents, confirmed to be Agnes Talbot's. The entry read, "They will not listen. I have told them 3 times now. The ventilation in the east dormitory is not adequate. The children wake coughing. I have reported this to the board. They say the building passed inspection. I do not care what the inspection said. The children are breathing something they should not breathe." The entry ended there. No further pages were found. March 14, 1892. One day before the board's quarterly meeting, the last meeting for which minutes were ever filed. 1 month before Mary Doherty died of pneumonia. 6 weeks before Thomas Carr died of typhoid. 2 months before Eliza Holbrook died of scarlet fever. 3 months before Samuel Bennett died of undetermined respiratory failure. The East Dormitory housed the youngest children, ages 4 through 9. Small beds arranged in 2 rows, 1 window south-facing with an iron grate. A coal stove in the corner for heat during winter months. Whitewashed walls, wooden floor. The 1891 inspection report noted the dormitory as adequate for current occupancy, ventilation sufficient per standard measurement. But the standard measurement was a formula based on cubic feet of air per child, calculated by room volume and window size. It did not account for coal smoke, for the lint and dust from the textile mills 2 blocks south, for the chemical fog that settled over Hartford's industrial north end during windless nights. It measured space, not air quality. Agnes Talbot was not a physician. She was not an engineer. But she knew when children could not breathe properly. She told the board 3 times, and 1 month later the first child died. Dr. Horace Lindley maintained a private practice at 47 Church Street, at within walking distance of Providence Street Orphanage. His case files, preserved by his grandson and donated to the Hartford Medical Historical Society in 1954, contained routine documentation, patient names, dates of examination, diagnoses, prescribed treatments. Methodical, legible, unremarkable. The records for Providence Street children spanned 1887 through early 1892. Minor ailments, seasonal illnesses, the predictable catalog of childhood disease. Then his handwriting changed. The entries for April 1892 onward showed increasing pressure on the page, words formed with heavier ink, certain phrases underlined twice. not the marks of haste but of emphasis, or perhaps frustration. April 9, 1892. Mary Kathleen Doherty, age 9. Persistent cough, fever 102 degrees Fahrenheit, lungs congested, pneumonia suspected. Recommended immediate isolation and improved ventilation, environment noted as contributory. April 27, 1892. Thomas Edwin Carr, age 7. Severe gastrointestinal distress, fever 103 degrees Fahrenheit, dehydration, typhoid suspected, water source questionable. Recommended testing of well, environment noted as contributory. May 19, 1892. Eliza Jane Holbrook, age 11. Throat inflammation, fever 104 degree growth, rash present, scarlet fever confirmed. Recommended quarantine and immediate disinfection of dormitory. Environment noted as contributory. June 3, 1892. Samuel Orrin Bennett, age 6. Labored breathing, fever 101 and breathing. Lungs exhibit abnormal sounds. No clear diagnosis. Respiratory failure imminent. Environment noted as contributory. 4 entries, 4 children. 4 times the physician wrote the same phrase. Environment noted as contributory. Not merely present. Contributory, a medical term implying causation, not coincidence. Dr. Lindley signed 4 death certificates between April and June 1892. Standard procedure required him to list cause of death and contributing factors. The certificates listed only the immediate cause: pneumonia, typhoid, scarlet fever, respiratory failure. They did not list environment as a contributing factor. They did not mention ventilation, water quality, or dormitory conditions. They were clean, bureaucratic, final. But his private case files told a different story. On June 10, 1892, 1 week after Samuel Bennett's death, Dr. Lindley wrote a letter to the Hartford Board of Health. The letter was discovered in 1973, misfiled in a folder labeled General Correspondence 1892. It read, "Gentlemen, I write to formally request an environmental inspection of Providence Street Orphanage. Over the past 3 months, 4 children under my care have died from illnesses that, while common, have occurred with unusual rapidity and severity. I have noted in each case that the living conditions appear to contribute to disease progression. The ventilation is inadequate. The water source has not been tested. The dormitories are overcrowded beyond what I consider medically advisable. I urge immediate action before further deaths occur. Respectfully, Dr. H. Lindley." The Board of Health received the letter on June 12, 1892. The receipt was stamped and filed. No inspection was conducted. No response was sent to Dr. Lindley. No action was taken. 6 weeks later, Agnes Talbot was relieved of her duties. 3 months later, the Board of Overseers stopped meeting. 6 months later, the orphanage closed. 12 months later, the building was sold, the children dispersed, and the documentary record sealed with silence. Dr. Lindley continued his practice until his death in 1908. His obituary in the Hartford Courant noted his service to the community, his dedication to the poor, his reputation for integrity. It did not mention Providence Street. It did not mention the letter he wrote requesting an inspection that never came. But his case files preserved what the city chose to ignore. 4 children died because the environment in which they lived was slowly killing them, and the institution responsible knew but did not act. Or perhaps could not. The Providence Street Orphanage was constructed in 1867 on land purchased from the Hartford Industrial Development Corporation. The plot measured 120 feet by 80 feet. Narrow, deep, bordered on 3 sides by commercial properties. To the south, a textile mill. To the east, a tannery. To the north, a coal yard. The orphanage was embedded in the city's industrial corridor, surrounded by factories that operated 12 hours per day, 6 days per week. The building's architect was a man named Roland Thayer, known for institutional efficiency rather than comfort. 3 stories, granite block construction, minimal ornamentation. Windows sized to meet minimum light requirements, not generosity. The structure was designed to house 50 children at maximum capacity, with dormitories on the 2nd floor, staff quarters on the 3rd, and kitchen, laundry, and storage in the basement. The heating system relied on coal stoves, 1 per floor, with rudimentary flue vents running through internal walls to the roof. Standard for the period. Functional in theory. But the ventilation depended entirely on window placement and natural airflow. There was no mechanical ventilation, no forced air circulation. The building breathed only when windows were opened, and windows could not remain open during Hartford's winters. The 1868 inspection report, filed after the building's first year of operation, noted, "Structure sound, heating adequate, ventilation meets minimum standard for occupancy." Minimum standard, not optimal, not generous, minimum. The 1875 inspection report, conducted after a minor outbreak of influenza, recommended improved ventilation in dormitories advised, current airflow insufficient during winter months when windows must remain closed. The recommendation was noted. No action was taken. The 1882 inspection report, following a complaint from a visiting minister, stated, "Dormitory conditions crowded. Ventilation remains inadequate. Recommend reduction of occupancy or structural modification to improve air circulation." The recommendation was noted. No action was taken. The 1889 inspection report, conducted by a new inspector following the previous inspector's retirement, concluded building meets current municipal standards for institutional housing. No immediate deficiencies observed. The earlier recommendations were not referenced. The ventilation concerns were not mentioned. The new inspector measured cubic feet of air per child, confirmed the number fell within acceptable range, and certified the building as compliant. But compliance with minimum standards did not mean the children could breathe properly. By 1892, the orphanage had been operating for 25 years. The coal stoves had been burning for 25 winters. The flue vents had been accumulating soot and creosote for 25 years. The dormitory walls had absorbed 25 years of smoke, moisture, and industrial particulates drifting in from the surrounding mills. The building was not actively dangerous. It was passively toxic, slowly, incrementally, invisibly degrading the air quality until the children's lungs could no longer compensate. Agnes Talbot noticed because she lived inside the building. Dr. Lindley noticed because he examined the children's lungs and heard the abnormal sounds. The Board of Overseers did not notice because they met 4 times per year for 2 hours each, in a ground floor office that received better airflow than the dormitories above. The children noticed because they woke coughing. But children in orphanages were expected to endure discomfort. Coughing was common, illness was routine. Death, while regrettable, was not unexpected in institutional settings where disease spread easily among crowded populations. 4 deaths in 3 months, however, was statistically unusual. Not catastrophic, but notable enough that a physician felt compelled to write a letter requesting investigation. The Board of Health received the letter and did nothing. Because investigating meant acknowledging that the building itself might be at fault. And acknowledging the building's fault meant acknowledging that the city had certified it as safe. And acknowledging the city's certification meant accepting responsibility for the deaths of children who had no family to demand accountability. So the letter was filed, the inspection never conducted, and the building's toxicity remained invisible, defined out of existence by the gap between minimum standards and actual survival. The Board of Overseers for Providence Street Orphanage consisted of 7 members in 1891. Reverend Samuel Ho, chairman, Episcopalian minister, age 62, served on the board since 1879. Reverend Peter Callahan, Catholic priest, age 55, joined the board in 1884. Reverend Isaiah Proctor, Methodist minister, age 49, appointed to the board in 1888. Mr. Thomas Whitmore, treasurer, merchant, age 41, assumed financial oversight in 1886. Mr. Edward Brennan, factory owner, age 58. Board member since 1881. Dr. William Ashford, physician, age 63, not the orphanage's attending doctor, but a board member since 1883. Mr. Leonard Chase, secretary, attorney, age 47, appointed in 1887. These were not absentee overseers. They attended quarterly meetings, they signed inspection reports, they approved budgets, their names appeared on official correspondence. They represented the institutional authority that governed the orphanage's operations. By December 1892, 6 of the 7 had resigned or disappeared from the record. Thomas Whitmore resigned in February 1892, 1 month before the last documented board meeting. His resignation letter stated no reason. He continued operating his merchant business in Hartford until 1895, then moved to New York. He died in 1903. His obituary made no mention of his service to Providence Street Orphanage. Leonard Chase resigned in May 1892, 2 weeks after Eliza Holbrook's death. His resignation letter, discovered in a misfiled folder in 1968, read, "I can no longer in good conscience serve in a capacity that requires me to certify conditions I do not believe to be safe." He did not specify what conditions. He did not name names. He resigned and returned to private legal practice. Edward Brennan stopped attending meetings after March 1892. No resignation letter was ever filed. His name simply ceased appearing on board documents. He remained in Hartford, continued operating his factory, and never publicly explained his departure. When asked years later by a historian researching Hartford's industrial philanthropists, his son stated only, "My father preferred not to discuss his time with the orphanage." Dr. William Ashford moved to Boston in July 1892. No resignation, no forwarding notice. The city directory for 1893 listed him as relocated. His medical practice was transferred to a colleague. He died in 1897. His personal papers contained no reference to Providence Street. Reverend Peter Callahan was reassigned to a parish in western Massachusetts in August 1892. Church records indicated the transfer was at his request. He served there until his death in 1911, never returning to Hartford. Reverend Isaiah Proctor resigned from the board in September 1892, citing health concerns. He continued serving his congregation in Hartford until his retirement in 1899. His health concerns were never documented as requiring medical treatment. Only Reverend Samuel Ho remained on record through the orphanage's closure in 1893. He signed the final dissolution documents. He provided no explanation for the missing records, the absent accounting, or the vanished year. When interviewed by a reporter in 1894 regarding the orphanage's closure, he stated, "The institution served its purpose. The need diminished. The board acted accordingly." The reporter asked about the gap in the records. Reverend Ho replied, "Administrative matters were handled appropriately by those responsible at the time." The reporter asked about the 4 children who died in 1892. Reverend Ho replied, "I am not aware of any unusual circumstances regarding those deaths." The interview was published in the Hartford Times on March 12, 1894. It was Reverend Ho's only public statement about Providence Street Orphanage. He died in 1901. His personal papers, donated to the Connecticut Historical Society, contain no correspondence, no meeting notes, no documentation related to the orphanage beyond official filings. 6 board members left by resignation, transfer, or silence between February and September 1892. The institution's governing body disintegrated over 7 months, each member departing without coordinating with the others, without formal explanation, as if they had independently reached the same conclusion. Remaining would require them to acknowledge something they could not acknowledge, or perhaps testify to something they could not afford to testify to, because the board's legal obligation was oversight. If the building's conditions contributed to the children's deaths, and Dr. Lindley's case files suggested they did, then the board was responsible for allowing those conditions to persist. Resignation removed them from ongoing liability. Silence prevented their testimony from becoming evidence. They left the institution to collapse on its own, taking the missing year with it. Samuel Orrin Bennett died on June 3, 1892, age 6, of undetermined respiratory failure. His death certificate listed Providence Street Orphanage as his residence. The city burial registry recorded his interment in Cedar Hill Cemetery on June 5. The cemetery sexton's ledger confirmed payment for his burial plot, but Samuel Bennett's name appeared nowhere in the orphanage's admission records. The intake ledger, preserved through 1891, documented every child received by the institution: name, age, date of admission, guardian or court authority, reason for placement, detailed, methodical, legally required. The ledger listed 47 children present as of December 31, 1891. Samuel Bennett was not among them. Mary Doherty, admitted October 12, 1889. Thomas Carr, admitted February 8, 1890. Eliza Holbrook, admitted August 23, 1890. Samuel Bennett, no entry. 3 possibilities existed. 1. Samuel Bennett was admitted in 1892 after the ledger stopped being maintained and his intake was never recorded. 2. Samuel Bennett was never formally admitted, but was residing at the orphanage through some informal arrangement. 3. Samuel Bennett's intake record was deliberately removed. The first possibility required that the orphanage continued operating through at least part of 1892, accepting children, housing them, feeding them, while simultaneously ceasing all documentation. Possible, but unlikely. Institutions did not selectively abandon record-keeping. If the ledger stopped in December 1891, the orphanage's operations had likely ceased or drastically changed. The second possibility suggested that Samuel Bennett was placed at Providence Street without the legal documentation required by Connecticut law. Children could not be institutionalized without court order or guardian signature. The city would not have accepted the orphanage's designation on his death certificate without proof of legal custody. Yet the burial proceeded under Providence Street's authority, implying that someone vouched for the placement. The third possibility suggested that Samuel Bennett's admission record existed at some point, but was removed after his death. If his intake was documented in the missing 1892 records, his existence would have been erased along with the rest of that year. But his death certificate and burial survived because those records were filed with the city, beyond the institution's control. A child existed only in death, with no documentary evidence of his life before the moment he stopped breathing. Hartford city directories from 1890 to 1891 listed no family named Bennett at any address within the city limits. Census records from 1890 showed no Samuel Bennett of appropriate age in Hartford County. No birth certificate on file. No baptismal record in any Hartford church. No school enrollment. No prior institutional placement. He appeared in the documentary record only on June 3, 1892, when Dr. Horace Lindley certified his death. Dr. Lindley's case files contained one entry for Samuel Bennett, dated June 3. Age 6. Labored breathing, fever 101 degrees Fahrenheit. Lungs exhibit abnormal sounds. No clear diagnosis. Respiratory failure imminent. Environment noted as contributory. No prior examination noted. No medical history. Dr. Lindley examined the child for the first time on the day he died. Either Samuel Bennett had never been ill before June 3rd, unlikely for a 6-year-old living in institutional conditions, or Dr. Lindley had never been called to examine him previously, which suggested that Samuel Bennett had not been at Providence Street long enough to require medical attention until the day he died, or had been deliberately kept away from medical oversight. The orphanage required monthly health inspections for all children. Dr. Lindley conducted those inspections as part of his contract. If Samuel Bennett was present during any inspection between January and May 1892, Dr. Lindley would have documented it. But his files contained no record of Samuel Bennett until the day of his death, which meant Samuel Bennett either arrived at Providence Street shortly before June 3rd, or had been present but hidden from medical inspection. Neither explanation was benign. A child admitted days before his death suggested desperation, a family or guardian seeking last resort placement for a child already critically ill. But such placements required documentation. No intake record existed. A child present, but hidden from inspection, suggested something darker, an informal placement, an undocumented custody arrangement, a child existing outside the institution's official population, invisible to oversight, unaccounted for in budget or capacity calculations. A ghost until his death forced him into the record. Dr. Horace Lindley noted in his case file for Thomas Carr, who died of typhoid on April 27, 1892, water source questionable. Providence Street Orphanage drew water from a well located in the basement, drilled in 1867 when the building was constructed. Standard practice for the period. Municipal water service existed in Hartford by 1892, but many older buildings retained their wells, particularly institutions seeking to minimize operating costs. The well was never tested. Connecticut law required wells serving institutional populations to be tested annually for contamination. The Board of Overseers was responsible for ensuring compliance. Inspection reports from 1889 through 1891 noted water source adequate, but contained no reference to testing results, chemical analysis, or bacterial assessment. Adequate was an observation, not a measurement. Typhoid fever, caused by Salmonella typhi bacteria, spreads through contaminated water or food. An outbreak requires a sustained source of infection, water drawn from a well compromised by sewage, industrial runoff, or animal waste. A single case might be coincidental. Multiple cases within a short time frame suggested systemic contamination. Thomas Carr was the only documented typhoid case at Providence Street in 1892. But the missing records meant there was no way to confirm whether other children had exhibited symptoms, been treated, or recovered without Dr. Lindley's involvement. The basement where the well was located also housed the orphanage's privy vault, a cesspit where waste was collected before periodic removal by municipal sanitation workers. The vault was built 8 feet from the well. Both structures were set in groundwater-bearing soil. The basement floor was dirt, covered with wooden planks. The proximity was not unusual for 1867. Sanitation science was rudimentary. The theory that disease could spread through contaminated groundwater was still being established. Many institutional buildings placed wells and waste facilities in close proximity, relying on soil filtration to prevent contamination. But soil filtration was unreliable. A compromised privy vault, cracked masonry, overflow during heavy rain, inadequate depth, could leach bacteria directly into the water table. And after 25 years of continuous use, the vault's structural integrity was uncertain. No inspection of the basement infrastructure was conducted in 1892. Dr. Lindley's letter to the Board of Health requested testing of the water source. The request was filed and ignored. If the well was contaminated, every child drinking from it was at risk. Typhoid had an incubation period of 1 to 3 weeks. Symptoms included fever, gastrointestinal distress, dehydration. Severe cases caused organ failure and death. Children with already compromised health, from poor ventilation, malnutrition, or other environmental stressors, were particularly vulnerable. Thomas Carr died of typhoid. Mary Doherty died of pneumonia 1 month earlier. Eliza Holbrook died of scarlet fever 1 month later. Samuel Bennett died of respiratory failure 1 week after that. 4 different illnesses, or 4 manifestations of the same underlying cause, an environment that systematically weakened the children's bodies until any infection became lethal. The building was killing them slowly, and the well might have been the mechanism. But proving contamination required testing. Testing required acknowledging the possibility of contamination. Acknowledging contamination required accepting that the institution had failed in its most basic duty, providing safe drinking water. So the well was never tested. And the question remained unanswered, sealed behind the same silence that erased the rest of 1892. In 1923, a Hartford journalist named Robert Halloran was researching a series on the city's abandoned buildings. He interviewed an elderly woman named Catherine Morrissey, age 73, who had lived across the street from Providence Street Orphanage during its final years. The interview was published in the Hartford Courant on October 14, 1923, 31 years after the orphanage closed. Mrs. Morrissey's testimony was brief, embedded in a longer article about Hartford's institutional history. Most readers likely overlooked it, but the transcript survived. "I remember the spring of 1892, Mrs. Morrissey said. The children stopped playing in the yard. I used to see them out there most afternoons when the weather was fair, running, shouting, the way children do. But that spring, the yard was empty. I thought perhaps they'd been taken on an outing or moved to another building. But weeks passed and I never saw them outside again." The journalist asked if she had inquired about the children's absence. "I asked the matron once," Mrs. Morrissey replied. "Mrs. Talbot. She was a stern woman, but not unkind. I asked her why the children were no longer outside. She looked at me for a long moment, then said, 'They are not well.' I asked if there was illness in the house. She said, 'There is always illness in such places.' Then she went inside and closed the door." The journalist asked if Mrs. Morrissey remembered anything else unusual about that spring. "The windows were closed," she said, "even on warm days. I thought it strange. The building always seemed to need air. But the windows stayed shut. And at night, I could hear coughing. Not loud, but persistent. the kind of sound that makes you pull your own blankets tighter. The journalist asked if she had seen any of the children who died that spring. "I saw the undertaker's wagon," Mrs. Morrissey said, "4 times between April and June. Small coffins. I did not know their names then. I only knew they were from the orphanage because of where the wagons stopped. The burials happened quietly, no services that I knew of. Just the wagon arriving, the coffin loaded, and then gone." The journalist asked if she had ever spoken to anyone from the Board of Overseers about what she observed. Who would listen to a woman's concerns about an orphanage? Mrs. Morrissey replied, "They had their inspections, they had their reports. I had only what I saw from my window." The interview ended there. Robert Halloran noted in his article that Mrs. Morrissey's recollections, while vivid, could not be independently verified. He treated her testimony as anecdotal color rather than evidence, but her account matched the documentary fragments. The children stopped playing outside. The windows remained closed despite warm weather. The building's atmosphere turned inward, stifling, as if sealing itself off from observation. Agnes Talbot's diary entry from March 14th mentioned children waking with coughs. Mrs. Morrissey heard coughing through closed windows at night. The orphanage was suffocating its children behind closed windows because opening them would have required admitting that the interior air was toxic. The solution, ventilation, would have revealed the problem, that the building's atmosphere was unbreathable. So the windows stayed closed. The children stayed inside, and 4 of them died while a neighbor watched from across the street, knowing something was wrong but unable to articulate what, or to whom, or whether anyone would care. The Providence Street Orphanage building was sold on June 18, 1893, for $2,200. The buyer was Hartford Industrial Properties, a development corporation that acquired aging structures for demolition or conversion. The sale was recorded in the city land records with minimal detail. Property description, sale price, buyer and seller signatures. No inspection report. No disclosure of prior use or condition. The building had been empty for approximately 6 months. The children had been dispersed to other institutions in late 1892. The staff had been dismissed. The Board of Overseers had dissolved. The structure stood vacant, its windows dark, its doors locked, while the city decided what to do with it. Hartford Industrial Properties intended to convert the building into worker housing, subdivided rooms for mill employees, minimal renovation, maximum occupancy. The plan was approved by the City Zoning Board in July 1893. Construction was scheduled to begin in September, but the building was never converted. In August 1893, a structural inspector hired by Hartford Industrial Properties filed a report stating, "Foundation unstable. Basement exhibits water damage and possible contamination. Flue system inadequate and potentially hazardous. Recommend full structural assessment before any renovation." The full assessment was never conducted. Hartford Industrial Properties abandoned the conversion plan and resold the building in November 1893 to a salvage company for $800, less than half what they had paid 6 months earlier. The salvage company stripped the building of usable materials, window frames, doors, wooden beams, the coal stoves, copper piping. The granite blocks were sold for reuse in other construction projects. By March 1894, the structure had been reduced to a foundation and partial walls. But the salvage crew refused to work in the basement. The foreman, a man named Patrick Gill, submitted a complaint to the salvage company owner in February 1894. The complaint, discovered in a private collection of Hartford business correspondence in 1989, read, "The men will not enter the basement longer than necessary to remove materials. They report difficulty breathing and persistent coughing after working below ground. The air is foul and the smell suggests contamination. I recommend we forfeit salvage of basement materials rather than risk the crew's health." The basement was sealed rather than excavated. The foundation was covered with filled dirt. The lot was cleared and left vacant. The property remained undeveloped for 43 years. In 1936, the city acquired the lot through tax foreclosure and designated it as a public works staging area, a place to store equipment, gravel, and municipal materials. The basement was never reopened. The well was never capped properly. The privy vault was never excavated. When the demolition crew discovered Agnes Talbot's diary page hidden behind a brick in 1936, they also noted that the basement walls exhibited unusual discoloration, dark stains that suggested either prolonged water seepage or organic decomposition. The crew supervisor recommended environmental testing before any further excavation. The testing was never conducted. The lot remained a staging area until 1967, when the city sold it to a commercial developer. The developer built a parking structure, driving pilings 50 feet into the ground, bypassing the original foundation entirely. The orphanage basement was buried beneath concrete and asphalt, sealed permanently under the weight of a structure that served no purpose beyond convenience. The building that killed 4 children in 1892 was never fully investigated, never properly remediated, never held accountable. It was simply erased, first through documentation, then through demolition, then through burial under layers of development that ensured no one would ever excavate deeply enough to find what had been hidden there. But the question remained, suspended in the absence of answers. What exactly was in that basement that made grown men refuse to work there 42 years after the orphanage closed? When Providence Street Orphanage closed in late 1892, 43 children remained under its care. 4 had died between April and June. The rest, ages 4 through 16, were transferred to other institutions across Hartford County between September and December 1892. The transfers were documented in a single-page memorandum filed with the city clerk's office in January 1893, listing only the receiving institutions and the number of children sent to each. St. Agnes Home, 14 children. Hartford County Poorhouse, 11 children. Private placements, unspecified, 18 children. No names, no ages, no individual records tracing which child went where. The dispersal ensured that no concentration of former Providence Street residents remained in any single location. The children who had witnessed whatever occurred during the missing year of 1892 were scattered, their testimony fragmented across multiple institutions, their memories diluted by new surroundings and new populations. Some would have been too young to articulate what they had experienced. Others would have learned quickly that institutions did not reward children who spoke about discomfort, fear, or death. Survival in such places required silence, but institutional records from the receiving facilities contained fragments. St. Agnes Home, a Catholic orphanage operated by the Sisters of Mercy, kept intake records for all children received. The ledger for late 1892 noted 14 children transferred from Providence Street Orphanage. Multiple arrivals exhibited respiratory difficulties and general weakness. Medical examinations conducted, treatments administered, all recovered to adequate health within 6 months. Respiratory difficulties, multiple children, 6 months to recover. The Hartford County Poorhouse maintained less detailed records, but the superintendent's annual report for 1893 included a passing reference. Children received from closed institutions presented challenges due to prior neglect and insufficient care. Several required extended medical attention before becoming suitable for placement or indenture. Prior neglect, insufficient care, extended medical attention. The private placements, 18 children placed with individual families or smaller institutions, left almost no documentary trace. No registry existed requiring private guardians to report on the children's condition or outcome. They vanished into the vast informal network of 1890s child welfare, where oversight was minimal and follow-up non-existent. But one private placement left a record. In 1941, a woman named Eleanor Whitcomb died in Springfield, Massachusetts, age 57. Her obituary noted that she had been orphaned as a child and raised by a guardian family in Hartford. Her personal papers, donated to a local historical society, included a brief handwritten memoir titled Recollections of Childhood. Eleanor Whitcomb had been Eliza Whitcomb before her marriage, and before that she had been Eliza Whitcomb, admitted to Providence Street Orphanage in 1890 at age 8, present during the spring of 1892, and transferred to a private family in December 1892. Her memoir contained one paragraph about Providence Street. I remember the orphanage as a place of shadows. The rooms were never warm enough and the air felt heavy, particularly in the dormitory where we slept. Many of us coughed through the night. 3 girls I knew died that spring: Mary, Eliza, and another whose name I have forgotten. I was told they had caught illnesses, but I remember thinking even then that we were all breathing something we should not breathe. When I left that place, I felt as though I had escaped something I did not yet have words to name. Eliza Whitcomb was 9 years old in 1892. She could not have understood concepts like toxic air quality, environmental contamination, or institutional negligence. But she knew that something in the building was wrong. She knew that children were dying. She knew that leaving felt like escape. And she remembered it 60 years later, clearly enough to write it down. Her memoir was published posthumously in a small circulation historical journal in 1943. It was not widely read. It did not prompt any investigation. It was filed among thousands of other personal recollections of 19th-century childhood, interesting to historians, but not evidence of anything actionable. Yet it confirmed what the documentary fragments suggested. The children knew. They felt the air growing heavier. They heard each other coughing. They watched their friends die. And when they were dispersed to other institutions, they carried that knowledge with them, unspoken perhaps, but remembered. The silence was not just institutional, it was personal, internalized by children who learned early that no one would believe them if they said that the building itself was dangerous. But one of them wrote it down decades later, when belief no longer mattered. The 1889 inspection of Providence Street Orphanage was conducted by a man named Gerald Ashford, no relation to Dr. William Ashford, the board member. Gerald Ashford was Hartford's municipal building inspector from 1887 to 1891. His responsibilities included certifying institutional structures for safety and compliance with city ordinances. He inspected schools, poorhouses, hospitals, and orphanages on an annual or biannual schedule, filing reports with the city clerk's office. His report on Providence Street, dated September 12, 1889, concluded, "Building meets current municipal standards for institutional housing. No immediate deficiencies observed." This was the report that overrode earlier recommendations for improved ventilation. This was the certification that allowed the orphanage to continue operating without modification. This was the official determination that the building was safe for 47 children to inhabit. Gerald Ashford resigned his position in January 1892. The resignation letter, filed with the mayor's office, gave no specific reason. It stated only, "Effective immediately, I relinquish my duties as municipal building inspector. I will provide no further assessments or certifications." He was 48 years old. He had no documented health issues. He did not retire. He continued working as a private civil engineer in Hartford until his death in 1919. But he never conducted another municipal inspection. Why would an inspector resign 2 months before 4 children died in a building he had certified as safe? The timeline suggested foreknowledge, or at least a suspicion that something was wrong with his previous assessments. If Gerald Ashford had begun to doubt the adequacy of his 1889 certification, resignation would protect him from responsibility for any subsequent failures. But there was no evidence that he had been contacted by Agnes Talbot, Dr. Lindley, or anyone else raising concerns about Providence Street. His resignation preceded Mary Doherty's death by 2 months. The gap suggested either extraordinary intuition or something else. In 1894, a Hartford newspaper ran a small article about the high turnover in the city's building inspection department. The article quoted an unnamed former inspector who said, "The standards we are asked to enforce are minimums, not safeguards. A building can meet every requirement and still be unsafe for human habitation. I could not continue certifying structures I would not send my own children into." The article did not name the former inspector, but the timing aligned with Gerald Ashford's resignation. If Ashford was the source, his statement implied that the problem was not unique to Providence Street, it was systemic. Municipal standards were designed to permit construction and occupation at the lowest possible cost, not to ensure genuine safety. Inspectors were asked to certify compliance, not adequacy. Ashford certified Providence Street as compliant in 1889. 3 years later, 4 children were dead. and the building's environment was noted by a physician as contributory to their deaths. Compliance with minimum standards had failed, but acknowledging that failure would have required Ashford to testify that his certification was inadequate, that he had followed procedure correctly but the procedure itself was insufficient. Such testimony would undermine not just his own authority, but the entire municipal inspection system. So he resigned instead, and the building he certified as safe continued operating for 3 more years, killing children in a manner that fell within the margins of regulatory acceptability. Because the law did not require buildings to be healthy, it required them only to meet minimum standards. And minimum standards, by definition, allowed for a certain amount of suffering, illness, and death, as long as it remained statistically unremarkable. 4 children dead in 3 months was not remarkable enough to trigger official intervention. It was simply the acceptable cost of institutional efficiency. Hartford in 1892 had 6 institutions housing dependent children: Providence Street Orphanage, St. Agnes Home, St. Francis Orphan Asylum, the County Poorhouse, the Industrial School for Girls, and the Hartford Orphan Asylum. Mortality records from 1892, compiled by the City Health Department and preserved in annual reports, listed the following child deaths attributed to institutional residents: Providence Street Orphanage, 4 deaths; St. Agnes Home, 2 deaths; St. Francis Orphan Asylum, 1 death; County Poorhouse, 7 deaths including adults; Industrial School for Girls, 0 deaths; Hartford Orphan Asylum, 3 deaths. Total, 17 deaths across 6 institutions in 1 year. The city's total population of institutionalized children in 1892 was approximately 340. A mortality rate of 5% was considered acceptable for the period, high by modern standards, but unremarkable in an era when childhood disease was common and medical intervention limited. Providence Street's 4 deaths represented 9.3% of its population, 43 children remaining in late 1892. Plus the 4 who died. Higher than average, but not catastrophically so. Other institutions experienced similar or higher rates in different years. The deaths were statistically defensible. But statistics obscured patterns. All 4 Providence Street deaths occurred within a 3-month period, April through June. All 4 occurred in children housed in the same dormitory, the East Wing, 2nd floor. All 4 were attributed to different illnesses, suggesting no single epidemic. All 4 were noted by the attending physician as environmentally contributory. No other institution in Hartford reported a similar cluster. St. Agnes Home's 2 deaths occurred in January and November, separated by 10 months, attributed to influenza and measles respectively. St. Francis Orphan Asylum's death was a drowning accident. Hartford Orphan Asylum's 3 deaths were scattered across the year, attributed to diphtheria, scarlet fever, and tuberculosis. Different causes, different timelines, different patterns. Only Providence Street exhibited concentrated mortality linked to environmental factors. But the City Health Department's annual report did not analyze patterns. It listed numbers: 4 deaths at Providence Street, 2 at St. Agnes, 3 at Hartford Orphan Asylum. The totals were recorded, filed, and forgotten. No investigation was triggered by the concentration of deaths. No comparison was made between institutions. No questions were asked about why one building killed 4 children in 3 months, while another building, housing more children, experienced no deaths at all. The health department's mandate was to track disease outbreaks, epidemics that threatened public health. 4 children dying of different illnesses in a single institution did not meet the threshold for epidemic classification. Pneumonia, typhoid, scarlet fever, and respiratory failure were common causes of childhood mortality. Their occurrence in one location was unfortunate but not unprecedented. The system was designed to identify contagion, not environmental toxicity. It could recognize when disease spread from child to child. It could not recognize when a building itself was the contagion. So Providence Street's 4 deaths were recorded as individual tragedies, rather than a pattern. The institution's closure in 1893 was noted as an administrative decision, not a response to mortality. The building's sale and eventual demolition were treated as routine property transactions, not the removal of a hazard. The fever houses, institutions where children died at rates exceeding the average, were never formally identified because the city had no framework for identifying them. Mortality was tracked, but causation was not. And without causation, there could be no accountability. Institutional photography became common in the 1880s, used by orphanages, asylums, and reformatories to document their populations and operations. The photographs served multiple purposes: fundraising, public relations, and internal record-keeping. Hartford's orphanages maintained photographic archives showing children in dormitories, classrooms, and yards, clean, orderly, supervised. The images were staged, but they provided visual evidence of institutional conditions. St. Agnes Home preserved a complete photographic record from 1885 through 1920. The images showed children at meals, in chapel, during recreation. The Hartford Orphan Asylum maintained a similar collection. Even the county poorhouse, despite its reputation for grim conditions, commissioned occasional photographs for annual reports. Providence Street Orphanage had no surviving photographs from 1892. The institution's earlier photographic record was sparse but present. A group portrait from 1887 showed children arranged on the front steps, Agnes Talbot standing to the side, the building's granite facade visible behind them. Another image from 1889 showed the dormitory, rows of small beds, whitewashed walls, one window. But no photographs documented the orphanage during its final year. Either none were taken or all were destroyed. Institutional photography required planning. A photographer was hired, children were assembled, staff were positioned. The resulting images were carefully preserved. They represented the institution's public face. Losing or discarding such photographs was unusual, particularly for a building operating for 25 years. Yet when the orphanage closed and its materials were dispersed, no photographic archive was transferred to any receiving institution or municipal repository. The Hartford Historical Society, which acquired records from multiple closed orphanages, received nothing from Providence Street beyond the intake ledger ending in 1891. The absence suggested deliberate destruction rather than accidental loss. Someone decided that no visual record of Providence Street's final year should survive. Either the photographs were never taken, implying that conditions were too grim to document, or they were taken and subsequently destroyed, implying that the images showed something the institution could not afford to preserve. What would an 1892 photograph of the East Dormitory have shown? Rows of small beds, closed windows, children with hollow faces and visible ribs. The physical evidence of inadequate ventilation, insufficient nutrition, and environmental toxicity that words alone could not fully convey. Or perhaps the photographs would have shown nothing unusual. Just another institutional dormitory, indistinguishable from any other, its toxicity invisible to the camera because air quality could not be captured on glass plates. But if the photographs were benign, there would be no reason to destroy them. Their absence was evidence of something worth hiding. In 1938, a Hartford antiquarian dealer acquired a collection of uncatalogued photographs from an estate sale. Among them was a single image labeled only Hartford Institution, circa 1890. The photograph showed a dormitory interior, small beds, whitewashed walls, one window. The dealer noted the image in his inventory but did not identify the specific institution. The photograph was sold to a private collector in 1940 and has not resurfaced in public collections. A researcher examining the dealer's inventory in 1982 noted that the photograph's description matched the known layout of Providence Street Orphanage's East Dormitory. But without the original image, confirmation was impossible. If that photograph was from Providence Street, it was the last surviving visual record of the building's interior, preserved by accident, circulated anonymously, lost before anyone recognized its significance. Or perhaps it was not from Providence Street at all. Perhaps it was from any of a dozen similar institutions, their dormitories interchangeable, their conditions indistinguishable. Which itself was evidence that Providence Street was not uniquely terrible, but typically so. That its toxicity was not exceptional but ordinary, that children were dying quietly in buildings across the city, and no one was documenting it because no one believed the documentation mattered. The photographs were missing, because the truth they might have shown was not worth preserving. In 1967, during renovation of Hartford's Municipal Archives building, a maintenance worker discovered a box of misfiled correspondence wedged behind a radiator in the basement. The box contained miscellaneous letters dating from 1890 to 1895, most of them routine municipal business, requests for permits, property disputes, complaints about street conditions. One letter, dated July 15, 1892, was addressed to the mayor of Hartford. It was written in careful, practiced handwriting on plain stationery. The sender's name and address appeared at the top. Leonard Chase, attorney at law, 43 Asylum Street, Hartford, Connecticut. Leonard Chase was the Board of Overseers secretary who resigned in May 1892. This letter was written 2 months after his resignation, 1 month after Samuel Bennett's death. The letter read, "Your Honor, I write to inform you of conditions at Providence Street Orphanage that I believe warrant immediate investigation. During my tenure as Secretary of the Board of Overseers, I became increasingly concerned about the environmental safety of the building. Despite multiple recommendations from medical and administrative personnel, no structural improvements have been implemented. 4 children have died in recent months under circumstances that suggest the building's atmosphere is contributing to illness and mortality. I resigned my position because I could not continue to serve an institution that, in my judgment, places children at unnecessary risk. I urge you to order an independent inspection before further tragedy occurs. Respectfully, Leonard Chase." The letter was received by the mayor's office on July 18, 1892. A clerk stamped it with the date and filed it in the general correspondence folder. No response was ever sent. No investigation was ordered. The letter remained in the archives for 75 years, unread by anyone with authority to act on its contents. Why did Chase write to the mayor after resigning from the board? Because resignation removed him from institutional responsibility, but not from moral obligation. He could no longer prevent harm as a board member, but he could report it as a citizen. Why did the mayor's office not respond? Because investigating a closed institution, Providence Street had effectively ceased operations by July 1892, would have required acknowledging that the city had failed to supervise it adequately while it was operating. Acting on Chase's letter meant admitting that 4 children had died preventably, under municipal oversight. Silence was cheaper than accountability. Chase's letter was the only known written testimony from a board member explicitly stating that Providence Street's building was dangerous. It was the only document linking the children's deaths directly to environmental conditions. It was the clearest evidence that responsible parties knew what was happening and chose to do nothing. And it was buried in a basement for 75 years, discovered by accident, too late to matter. When the letter surfaced in 1967, it was catalogued as part of Hartford's Municipal History collection. A researcher examining the archives in 1973 noted its significance and published a brief article in a regional history journal. The article was titled "A Forgotten Warning: Child Mortality in 19th Century Hartford Institutions." The article attracted minimal attention. By 1973, Providence Street Orphanage had been closed for 80 years. The building was gone. The children were long dead. The board members were dead. The mayor who received the letter was dead. There was no one left to hold accountable. But Chase's letter proved that the silence was not accidental. It was deliberate. The mayor received a direct warning that children were dying in a building that was environmentally unsafe. The mayor's office chose not to investigate. Not because they did not know, because knowing required action, and action required acknowledging failure, and acknowledging failure carried political and legal consequences that outweighed the lives of 4 orphaned children. So the letter was filed, the investigation was never conducted, and Providence Street Orphanage continued erasing itself from history, one document at a time. Dr. Horace Lindley was not the only physician who treated children at Providence Street Orphanage. The institution's records from 1887 through 1891 listed occasional consultations with other doctors, specialists called in for severe cases, second opinions on diagnoses, surgeries requiring skills beyond Dr. Lindley's general practice. These physicians left minimal documentation, brief notes in the orphanage ledger, invoices for services rendered, no detailed case files. But one name appeared repeatedly in the financial records from 1889 through 1891. Dr. William Ashford, the board member. Dr. Ashford provided occasional medical care beyond his oversight duties, treating children when Dr. Lindley was unavailable, examining new admissions, conducting quarterly health inspections alongside Lindley. His involvement was documented in ledger entries noting medical services rendered and corresponding fees. His last recorded service at Providence Street was March 1892, the same month as the final board meeting, the same month Agnes Talbot wrote in her diary that the children were coughing. Then he stopped treating the children. No documented refusal, no explanation. He simply ceased providing medical care to the institution where he served as a board member. 1 month later, Mary Doherty died. 2 months later, he relocated to Boston. Why would a physician who had been treating children for 3 years suddenly stop just before a series of deaths occurred? One possibility: he recognized that the children's illnesses were environmentally caused and realized he could not treat them effectively without addressing the building's conditions. Continuing to provide care while knowing the environment was toxic would have made him complicit in their suffering. Another possibility: he disagreed with the board's refusal to act on ventilation concerns and withdrew his services as a form of protest. But protest required visibility, and Ashford's departure was silent, documented only by the absence of his name in ledgers. A third possibility: he understood that the children's deaths were becoming inevitable and did not want his name associated with the outcomes. Physicians could be held liable for negligence if their treatments failed to prevent mortality. Withdrawing from the case protected him from future legal or professional consequences. Whatever his reasoning, Dr. Ashford's withdrawal left Dr. Lindley as the sole medical authority during the spring of 1892. The physician who would sign 4 death certificates, write an unanswered letter to the Board of Health, and carry the knowledge of those deaths for the rest of his career. Dr. Lindley's private practice thrived after 1892. His patient base expanded. His reputation remained solid. But his case files from the mid-1890s onward showed a pattern. He refused to treat children in institutional settings. When asked by St. Agnes Home to serve as their contracted physician in 1894, he declined. When the Hartford Orphan Asylum sought his services in 1896, he declined. He limited his practice to private patients, families, individuals, anyone who lived in a home he could inspect and assess. He never worked in another institution. The pattern suggested that Providence Street had changed his understanding of institutional medicine. He had seen what buildings could do to children when profit margins and minimum standards outweighed health. He had written a letter requesting investigation and been ignored. He had signed death certificates, knowing that the causes he listed, pneumonia, typhoid, scarlet fever, respiratory failure, were symptoms, not root causes. He could not prevent what the building had done, but he could refuse to participate in its repetition elsewhere. Other physicians did not share his restraint. The Hartford Medical Society's membership records from 1892 through 1900 listed dozens of doctors providing services to institutions across the city. None publicly questioned the safety of the buildings where children were housed. None wrote letters to the Board of Health raising environmental concerns. None testified about institutional conditions in public forums. The silence was professional, collective, and complete, because institutional medicine was lucrative. Contracts paid quarterly. Services were routine. Questions about building safety jeopardized relationships with boards, administrators, and city officials who controlled those contracts. Dr. Lindley asked questions and was ignored. The other physicians learned from his example. Asking questions produced no change but carried professional risk. Silence was safer. And so the physicians continued treating institutional children for illnesses caused by the buildings where they lived, prescribing treatments that could not work, signing death certificates that did not name the true cause, and collecting their fees without acknowledging that they were participants in a system that killed quietly, legally, and profitably. In 1989, a graduate student named Jennifer Carlisle was researching 19th-century child welfare systems for her dissertation at Yale University. She requested access to Hartford's municipal archives, specifically files related to closed institutions. The archivist provided her with boxes of documents, ledgers, correspondence, inspection reports. Among them was a folder labeled Providence Street Orphanage, Closure Documents, 1893. The folder contained standard materials: the property sale record, the board dissolution notice, the memorandum listing where children were transferred. But at the bottom of the folder, underneath everything else, was a single sheet of paper that did not belong. It was a handwritten list, undated, unsigned, written in pencil on lined notebook paper. The handwriting was hurried, unsteady, nothing like the careful script of official documents. The list contained 7 names: Mary Kathleen Doherty, April Thomas Edwin Carr, April Eliza Jane Holbrook, May Samuel Orrin Bennett, June Margaret Louise Crawford, March Anna Rose Delaney, February, Joseph Michael Sullivan, February. Jennifer Carlisle recognized the first 4 names immediately: the children buried in Cedar Hill Cemetery with the orphanage listed as residents. But the last 3 names were unfamiliar. She cross-referenced them against the burial registry. No matches. She checked the orphanage intake ledger. Margaret Crawford appeared, admitted in 1889. Anna Delaney appeared, admitted in 1890. Joseph Sullivan appeared, admitted in 1890. But none of them had death certificates filed with the city. The list suggested 7 children had died at Providence Street between February and June 1892, not 4. Jennifer Carlisle spent 6 months attempting to trace Margaret Crawford, Anna Delaney, and Joseph Sullivan. She searched cemetery records across Hartford County. She reviewed church burial registries. She examined poorhouse death logs, hospital admissions, and transfer documents from receiving institutions. She found nothing: no death certificates, no burial records, no documentation of what happened to 3 children who appeared on a list of the dead but were never officially recorded as dying. She presented her findings in a conference paper in 1990 titled "Lost Children: Undocumented Mortality in Connecticut Institutions, 1890 to 1895. The paper raised questions about whether official death counts captured the full extent of institutional mortality. It suggested that some children died without being documented, either through administrative failure or deliberate omission. The paper was well received academically, but prompted no further investigation. Without death certificates or burial records, there was no evidence that Margaret Crawford, Anna Delaney, and Joseph Sullivan had died at all. They might have been transferred elsewhere, and the list was simply a draft, incomplete or inaccurate. But Jennifer Carlisle noted one detail that troubled her. The list was written in pencil, hurriedly, as if someone was recording names quickly, before they could be forgotten. The handwriting suggested stress or urgency. And the list had been hidden at the bottom of a folder, misfiled among closure documents where it would not be immediately visible. Someone had written down 7 names. Someone had wanted to remember all of them, but only 4 made it into the official record. The question Jennifer Carlisle could not answer: what happened to the other 3? Were they transferred before they died? Were they buried without proper documentation? Were their deaths recorded elsewhere under different names or jurisdictions? Or were they simply erased, removed from the record because acknowledging 7 deaths instead of 4 would have triggered the kind of investigation the institution could not afford? The list was evidence of absence. It proved that someone, somewhere, knew more children had died than the official count admitted. But without names on death certificates, without bodies in documented graves, there was no way to prove it conclusively. The 3 names remained suspended in documentary limbo, more than rumor, less than fact, present only in a penciled list that might have been a mistake, a draft, or a desperate attempt to ensure that someone, someday, would count all the dead. In 1994, a Hartford hospice worker named Rachel Torres was caring for an elderly woman dying of cancer. The woman, aged 97, had been a resident at Hartford Senior Care for 11 years. Her medical records listed her name as Margaret Walsh, widow, no surviving family. During one of their conversations, Mrs. Walsh mentioned that she had been orphaned as a child and raised in institutions. Rachel Torres, aware of Jennifer Carlisle's research from a local history article, asked if Mrs. Walsh remembered which institutions. Providence Street, Mrs. Walsh said. That was the first one. I was very young. I don't remember much. But I remember the coughing. Rachel Torres asked permission to record the conversation. Mrs. Walsh agreed. The recording, later transcribed and archived at the Hartford Historical Society, contained the following exchange. Torres, do you remember what year you were at Providence Street? I don't know the year. I was 5 or 6. It was winter, I think. Or early spring. Everything was cold. How long were you there? Not long, a few months. Then they moved us, me and the other children who were still, well, they moved us somewhere else. Do you remember why they moved you? I remember someone saying the building was closing, that we were going to a better place. I remember being glad to leave. You mentioned coughing. Were the children sick? Yes. Everyone coughed at night, some worse than others. There was a girl in the bed next to mine, Mary, I think her name was. She coughed until she couldn't breathe properly. Then one morning she wasn't there anymore. Do you remember what happened to her? The matron said she had gone to the hospital, but I don't think she came back. Do you remember the matron's name? Mrs. Talbot. She was strict, but I think she was frightened. I remember her face when the coughing got worse. She looked like she wanted to do something but couldn't. Do you remember anything else about the building? The windows were always closed. It felt like we couldn't breathe. And the smell, I don't know how to describe it, like something old and damp and wrong. I remember thinking even then that the house was sick. The interview continued for another 15 minutes, covering Mrs. Walsh's later placements, her eventual adoption by a Hartford family, her marriage. But the Providence Street portion was brief. Memories from early childhood, fragmentary and vague, but consistent with the documentary record. Margaret Walsh died 3 weeks later in February 1994. Her death certificate listed her birth year as 1897, which would have made her 5 years old in 1902, 10 years after Providence Street closed. The timeline did not align. Rachel Torres re-examined the hospice records. Mrs. Walsh's age had been estimated based on her own statements when she was admitted to the senior facility in 1983. She had no birth certificate on file, no documentation of her early years. Her age was approximate, possibly off by a decade. If Mrs. Walsh was actually born in 1887, she would have been 5 years old in 1892, the missing year. And the girl she remembered, Mary, who coughed until she couldn't breathe, would have been Mary Kathleen Doherty, who died of pneumonia in April 1892. Margaret Walsh might have been Margaret Crawford, one of the 3 names on the penciled list, one of the children who disappeared from the record. But without documentation, the connection remained speculative. What was certain? A woman who died in 1994 remembered Providence Street Orphanage as a place where children coughed through the night, where the air felt wrong, where the building itself seemed sick. She remembered being moved elsewhere when the institution closed. She remembered being glad to leave. She survived because she was transferred before the building could kill her. But she carried the memory for 90 years. The smell of damp, the sound of coughing, the fear in the matron's face. Proof that the children knew what was happening to them, even if they lacked the language to name it. Providence Street Orphanage was not unique. Between 1870 and 1900, municipal records across Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New York documented similar patterns in institutional child mortality. The numbers varied, but the structure was consistent. Institutions operating in aging buildings, minimal regulatory oversight, concentrated mortality during specific time periods, and rapid closure followed by documentary erasure. In 1888, the New Haven Children's Home experienced 6 deaths in 4 months. The institution closed the following year. Its records were incomplete. In 1891, the Springfield Orphan Asylum reported 5 deaths in a 2-month period. The building was condemned in 1892 and demolished in 1893. The children were dispersed. No investigation was conducted. In 1894, the Providence, Rhode Island Female Orphan Asylum had 7 deaths in one winter. The institution continued operating but relocated to a new building in 1895. The old structure was sold and converted into a warehouse. The mortality records from 1894 were misfiled and not discovered until 1967. These cases shared structural similarities with Providence Street. Concentrated mortality, environmental concerns raised and ignored, institutional closure or relocation, missing documentation, and no official accountability. Researchers examining 19th-century child welfare systems noted the pattern but struggled to quantify it. Official mortality statistics captured only reported deaths, those with death certificates, burial records, and institutional confirmation. Undocumented deaths, children who vanished from the record, mortality attributed to natural causes without investigation, these did not appear in aggregate data. The true scale of institutional child mortality remained unknown, obscured by the same mechanisms that erased Providence Street's records: minimum standards that permitted dangerous conditions, regulatory systems that prioritized compliance over safety, and institutions that protected themselves through silence. But one pattern emerged clearly from the fragmentary evidence. Buildings killed children, and everyone involved knew but could not afford to acknowledge it. Architects designed to minimum specifications. Inspectors certified compliance with inadequate standards. Boards prioritized budgets over renovations. Physicians treated symptoms without addressing environmental causes. City officials ignored warnings to avoid political embarrassment. And children died quietly, legally, within the margins of acceptable loss. Providence Street was not an outlier. It was typical, which meant the 4 documented deaths and possibly 7 were not isolated tragedies, but representative samples of a larger uncounted mortality occurring across hundreds of institutions where children lived in buildings that slowly poisoned them. The system was not broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, efficiently, economically, and with just enough documentation to maintain the appearance of oversight, while ensuring that no one could ever be held fully accountable for the outcomes. In 1973, after Leonard Chase's letter to the mayor surfaced in the archives, a Hartford city councilman named David Brennan, no relation to Edward Brennan, the former board member, called for a formal review of historical institutional oversight. The motion was seconded but never brought to vote. The city attorney advised that reviewing 19th-century institutional practices would serve no legal purpose. The institution was closed. The building was demolished. All responsible parties were deceased. No restitution could be made. No liability could be assigned. Opening a formal investigation would consume resources without producing actionable outcomes. The motion died in committee. David Brennan issued a public statement expressing regret for the deaths at Providence Street and noting that modern child welfare standards had evolved significantly since the 1890s. The statement concluded, "While we cannot change the past, we can learn from it and ensure that current institutions meet rigorous safety standards." No memorial was proposed for the children who died. No plaque was commissioned. The parking structure built over the orphanage site carried no indication of what had stood there previously. The city's response was procedural: acknowledge, express regret, move forward. Standard crisis management for historical controversies that carried no contemporary consequences. But the lack of response revealed something fundamental about institutional memory. Only the documented past can be officially acknowledged. Providence Street had erased itself so thoroughly that even when evidence surfaced decades later, there was insufficient documentation to construct a complete narrative of accountability. The 4 names in the burial registry existed. The 4 death certificates existed. Leonard Chase's letter existed. Agnes Talbot's diary fragment existed. Dr. Lindley's case files existed. The penciled list of 7 names existed. But these fragments did not cohere into the kind of official record that could prompt governmental action. They were evidence of something that had happened, but not proof of who was responsible, what specific failures occurred, or how to assign culpability across a dissolved institution and a dead board. The past was sufficiently erased that it could be acknowledged without consequences. In 1995, a Hartford community group petitioned the city to install a memorial at the parking structure site, listing the names of children who died at Providence Street. The petition included the 4 documented names and requested that space be left for others unknown. The city planning department denied the request, citing concerns about memorializing unverified claims and the potential for setting precedent regarding historical institutional controversies. The denial was appealed. The appeal was rejected. The parking structure remained unmarked. In 2003, a local historian proposed adding Providence Street Orphanage to the Hartford Historical Society's register of significant closed institutions. The proposal was accepted. The register entry published online included basic facts: operating dates, approximate population, closure date. It mentioned documented mortality during the institution's final months, but did not list names or causes. The entry was accurate, minimal, and carefully neutral, a bureaucratic acknowledgement that something had occurred without specifying exactly what. This was the city's final response to Providence Street. Inclusion in a historical database, accessible to anyone willing to search for it, but not prominently displayed, not memorialized, not integrated into Hartford's public memory of itself. The institution existed. Children died there. Then it was gone. That was all the city was willing to say. In 2008, the Hartford Municipal Archives underwent digitization. Interns scanned thousands of documents, creating searchable databases of property records, meeting minutes, correspondence, and institutional files. During the process, a file clerk named Thomas Hayden noticed something unusual while digitizing Board of Health records from 1892. The folder labeled General Correspondence, June 1892, contained Dr. Horace Lindley's letter requesting an inspection of Providence Street Orphanage. But the folder also contained a draft response, never sent. The draft was typed on official Board of Health letterhead, dated June 18, 1892. 6 days after Dr. Lindley's letter was received. It read, "Dear Dr. Lindley, thank you for bringing your concerns regarding Providence Street Orphanage to our attention. We have reviewed your request for an environmental inspection. At this time, our department lacks the resources to conduct comprehensive building assessments beyond epidemic response. We recommend you direct your concerns to the building inspector's office or the Board of Overseers directly. Respectfully, Dr. Samuel Morton, Hartford Board of Health." The letter was typed but never signed. A handwritten note in the margin read, "Do not send, refer to city attorney first." No follow-up correspondence existed. The draft was filed, and the matter was closed. Thomas Hayden flagged the document for the archives director. The director examined it and issued a memo to staff. This document reveals historical decision-making processes and should be preserved as part of the institutional record. It does not reflect current practices. The draft letter was added to the digitized database, accessible to researchers. It proved that the Board of Health had received Dr. Lindley's warning, had drafted a response, and then decided not to send it. The decision to remain silent was not accidental. It was deliberate, discussed, and documented. Why would the Board of Health draft a response and then suppress it? Sending the letter would have created a paper trail acknowledging that Dr. Lindley's concerns were received and considered. It would have established that the Board of Health was aware of potential environmental hazards at Providence Street. If children subsequently died, that awareness could become evidence of negligence, knowing about the danger but failing to investigate. Silence eliminated the paper trail. Without a response, there was no official acknowledgement that the warning had been taken seriously. If pressed later, the board could claim they had received many letters and could not recall the specifics of Dr. Lindley's concerns. But someone on the board recognized the legal risk. Someone wrote, "Refer to city attorney first?" In the margin, someone decided that not responding was safer than responding inadequately. And that decision sealed Providence Street's fate. Dr. Lindley's letter went unanswered. No inspection was conducted. Leonard Chase's subsequent letter to the mayor was similarly filed without response. The institution closed. The records were erased. And decades later, researchers would discover that the silence was not passive. It was strategic. The archive's confession was inadvertent. The draft letter was preserved because someone filed it alongside the original, creating a record of the decision not to respond. That record survived 76 years, digitized by an intern who had no idea what it meant, and finally made public in a database where most people would never search for it. But it existed. And it proved that Providence Street Orphanage did not fail because nobody knew what was happening. It failed because people knew, discussed it, consulted attorneys, and decided that acknowledging the problem would cost more than letting it continue. The children died because silence was cheaper than action, and the archive kept the proof. By 2010, Providence Street Orphanage had entered local folklore. Online forums discussing Hartford's history included threads about haunted buildings and forgotten institutions. Providence Street appeared occasionally, described as the orphanage where children died mysteriously, or the building that was demolished to hide the truth. The details were often wrong. Posters confused dates, inflated death counts, invented elaborate conspiracy theories. One thread claimed 12 children had died. Another claimed the building had been burned down deliberately. A third suggested the orphanage was part of a child trafficking network. None of these claims were supported by documentation, but the myth served a purpose. It transformed from a bureaucratic failure into a narrative of active malevolence. The myth was more satisfying than the truth because it provided clear villains, corrupt officials, and clear victims, innocent children, and clear moral lessons. Evil must be exposed. The truth was less satisfying: negligence, not malevolence. Institutional indifference, not active cruelty. A system functioning exactly as designed, with predictable casualties that no one cared enough to prevent. The myth implied that something extraordinary had happened. The truth was that nothing extraordinary had happened. Children died in institutions all the time, and Providence Street's failure was ordinary, systemic, and legally permissible. But ordinariness did not generate folklore. In 2015, a paranormal investigation group filmed an episode at the parking structure built over the orphanage site. They used electromagnetic sensors, audio recorders, and thermal cameras to detect spirits of the dead children. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. The basement had been filled and sealed. The building's materials had been salvaged and dispersed. The children's bodies were buried 3 miles away in Cedar Hill Cemetery, their graves marked by stones that were slowly sinking into the earth. But the paranormal investigators framed their lack of findings as evidence. The spirits here are so traumatized, they cannot communicate. The episode aired on a cable network, watched by thousands of people who learned about Providence Street through the lens of supernatural investigation rather than historical documentation. The myth became more widely known than the truth. In 2018, a Hartford high school teacher assigned students to research local historical sites. One student chose Providence Street Orphanage, using online sources. Her report repeated the inflated death counts and conspiracy theories, citing paranormal investigation websites as sources. The teacher corrected the sourcing, but noted in her feedback, "This is an interesting topic. You should visit the Historical Society to find primary sources." The student did not visit the Historical Society. Most people did not. Primary sources required time, effort, and institutional access. Online myths were immediately available, emotionally compelling, and easier to share. Providence Street became what all lost histories eventually become: a story shaped more by what people wanted to believe than by what actually happened. The myth suggested that remembering mattered, that truth could be recovered, that the past demanded justice. It transformed 4 documented deaths, possibly 7, into a morality tale about institutional evil and the heroic effort to expose it. But the actual history offered no such comfort. The truth was that Providence Street had been forgotten not because of a conspiracy, but because forgetting was easier. The children had died not because of villains, but because minimum standards permitted their deaths. And the silence had endured, not because records were destroyed, but because no one with power had any incentive to break it. The myth provided meaning. The truth provided only an ending. The building was gone. The children were dead. And the system that killed them had evolved just enough to appear different while remaining fundamentally unchanged. In 2019, a documentary filmmaker named Sarah Chen contacted the Hartford Historical Society requesting access to Providence Street Orphanage records. She intended to produce a short film about forgotten child welfare institutions in New England. The archivist provided her with the available materials, the intake ledger through 1891, the closure memorandum from 1893, Leonard Chase's letter, Dr. Linley's case files, Agnes Talbot's diary fragment, the penciled list of 7 names, the draft response from the Board of Health, and Jennifer Carlisle's conference paper. Sarah Chen spent 3 months reviewing the documents. She interviewed historians, examined municipal records, and visited Cedar Hill Cemetery to photograph the children's graves. Then she abandoned the project. In an email to the Historical Society, she explained, "I cannot construct a coherent narrative from these fragments. Every question leads to another gap in the record. I can prove that children died, but I cannot prove exactly why or who was responsible or how many actually died. The absence of evidence has become the story, and I don't know how to film absence." The Historical Society archived her research materials but never received the completed film. Sarah Chen's conclusion was accurate. Providence Street Orphanage could not be reconstructed into a complete story. The institutional erasure had been too thorough. The documentary gaps were too wide. The ambiguity was irreducible. What remained was a series of unanswerable questions. Did 7 children die, or only 4? Were Margaret Crawford, Anna Delaney, and Joseph Sullivan transferred elsewhere, or were their deaths simply undocumented? What exactly was wrong with the building's environment? Contaminated water, toxic air, both, or something else? Did the Board of Overseers actively suppress evidence, or did they simply fail to maintain records? Was Samuel Bennett admitted informally, or was his intake record deliberately removed? Why did Agnes Talbot hide her diary page behind a brick instead of taking it with her? Did the salvage crew in 1894 refuse to work in the basement because of actual contamination, or because of superstition? These questions could not be answered with the available evidence. More research might uncover additional fragments, but the core documents, the 1892 financial records, board meeting minutes, complete medical files, photographs, were gone. The absence was permanent. And yet the questions persisted, suspended in the documentary void, unanswerable but not dismissible, because the inability to prove exactly what happened did not mean nothing had happened. 4 children were buried in documented graves. 3 more names appeared on a list. A physician noted environmental factors. A matron reported ventilation problems. A board secretary resigned in protest. A building inspector quit rather than continue certifying structures he believed were unsafe. The pattern was clear even when the details were not. Providence Street Orphanage killed children through institutional negligence enabled by minimum standards, inadequate oversight, and systemic indifference to populations without political power. The exact mechanism remained uncertain. The exact count remained uncertain. But the outcome was documented. Children died preventably, adults knew and did nothing. The institution erased itself, and the city allowed the erasure to stand because accountability cost more than silence. That was what the evidence proved. Everything else was speculation, myth, or the kind of truth that could only be assembled from absence. The truth visible in what had been removed, destroyed, or never recorded in the first place. The question that remained was not what happened, but how many times did this happen, in how many institutions, to how many children whose names never made it into any record at all. Providence Street was documented only because a few fragments survived by accident. How many other institutions erased themselves so completely that not even fragments remained? The answer was unknowable, and that itself was evidence of how thoroughly the system protected itself. Cedar Hill Cemetery, Section G, Row 14. The municipal section, where Hartford buried its unclaimed dead between 1870 and 1920. Flat ground, minimal landscaping, stones arranged in tight rows. The section was full by 1925. No new burials were permitted. Maintenance was minimal, grass cutting twice per year, no repair of damaged markers. By 2020, most of the stones had sunk below grade or disappeared entirely. A cemetery preservation group conducted a survey in 2023, documenting what remained in Section G. Of the estimated 300 burials, only 47 stones were still visible and legible. The rest had been swallowed by earth, overgrown with grass, or removed during landscaping operations decades earlier. Among the visible stones, 3 marking the graves of children from Providence Street Orphanage. Mary Kathleen Doherty, 1883-1892. Thomas Edwin Carr, 1885-1892. Eliza Jane Holbrook, 1881-1892. The 4th grave, Samuel Orrin Bennett, was no longer marked. The Preservation Group's survey noted, stone presumed lost or fully submerged. Location uncertain. The cemetery's digital records confirmed that Samuel Bennett was buried in Section G, Row 14, but did not specify the exact plot. Without a visible marker, his grave could not be located. He had vanished a second time, first from the documentary record, now from the physical landscape. The Preservation Group proposed a memorial project. Install a single monument listing all documented children buried in Section G, including those whose stones were lost. The project required funding, city approval, and historical verification of names. The proposal was submitted to the Hartford Parks Department in 2024. As of 2025, it remains under review. If approved, the memorial might include Samuel Bennett's name, along with Margaret Crawford, Anna Delaney, and Joseph Sullivan, the children whose deaths were suggested but never confirmed. The plaque would note, "These children lived and died in Hartford's care. Some records were lost, all are remembered." But the memorial has not been built, and the stones continue sinking. Every year, rain and frost erode the limestone. Every year the ground settles. Every year, grass covers more of the inscriptions. In another 50 years, even the 3 remaining Providence Street markers will likely be illegible. The children will exist only in archival databases, accessible to researchers who know where to look but invisible to anyone walking through the cemetery. The physical evidence of their lives will have dissolved into the earth, just as the documentary evidence was dissolved by institutional silence. What remains is this: 4 names carved in stone that is slowly disappearing. 7 names written in pencil on a list that might be inaccurate. 43 children dispersed to institutions across Hartford, their fates unknown. An orphanage that erased its final year. A building that was demolished and buried beneath concrete. A system that functioned exactly as designed, killing children quietly and legally, within the acceptable margins of loss. And the question that will never be answered: how many other names should be on those stones in that list in the historical record, but are not, because someone decided they did not need to be remembered? The stones sink, the grass grows, the archives hold fragments, and Providence Street Orphanage remains what it has always been. A place where children died, adults knew, nobody acted, and the silence that followed was mistaken for the absence of evidence rather than recognized as evidence of absence. The building is gone. The children are buried. The records are incomplete. But the pattern persists. In other cities, other institutions, other closed buildings whose final years were erased, whose children's names appear only in fragments, whose truth survives only in the gaps between what was documented and what was lived. Providence Street is not history, it is structure. And the structure endures, quiet and functional, producing the same outcomes under different names. In places where minimum standards still permit suffering, where oversight still depends on voluntary reporting, where silence still costs less than accountability. The orphanage that erased its last year of records was not unique. It was ordinary. And that is the truth no memorial can capture. Not that something terrible happened once, in one place, to a few children whose names we barely remember, but that it happened everywhere, always, to thousands of children whose names were never recorded at all. The stones sink. The record fades, and somewhere in some institution, the pattern continues, because it was never about Providence Street. It was about the gap between what we document and what we permit. And in that gap, children still die quietly. Their absence is noted only when someone someday asks the question no one wants to answer. How many were there, really? The stones have no answer. Only silence, settling like earth over limestone, patient and permanent, until even the question is forgotten.